Order, order. Good morning, and could I welcome our witnesses this morning to the Scottish Affairs Committee. Scottish Affairs Committee evidence session into immigration in Scotland. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to be joined by Shane Taylor, who can't make it this morning. But we have got Mr. Gareth Williams and Mr. Barry McCulloch. Could you possibly just say which organisations you represent and anything by way of a short introductory statement, Mr. Williams? Oh yes, sorry. Press your green button to speak then. When you've concluded whatever your contribution is, just press it again if you don't mind. Thank you. Sorry, Gareth.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to come along and give evidence this morning. I'm Head of Policy at the Scottish Council for Development and Industry. Don't have much to say at the outset, other than obviously the industrial strategy is out today. And from our perspective, immigration has a key role in meeting the challenges for the economy, not just sectorally but regionally, and I think that's why it's particularly important that we have that discussion about Scotland's immigration needs.
Mr. McCulloch.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to contribute to what is, I think, a timely inquiry. By way of an opening remark, I'll just direct you to a lot of the research over the last year that the FSB has published on Brexit. And what we've tried to do is gauge the impact that Brexit will have on small businesses on 4 different areas. We looked at trade, freedom of movement, skills and labour, regulation and EU funding. And I think when you step back from that, you see that without doubt the impact that freedom of movement coming to an end will have and the creation of new immigration arrangements will be a significant implication for the business community, and I think there's just a few other points that I'd quite like to make. One
Can you just stop for a minute, Mr. McCulloch?
Yes, of course.
I'm having real difficulty in hearing some of this, and I think what would help us is if one of these speakers could be turned towards the committee. Would that be possible? There's a strange echo which is quite disconcerting, and I'm finding it difficult to follow our witnesses here. Is there anything that could be done to improve that at all? I'm noticing both the speakers are facing towards the public. If one was maybe to turn towards us, would that help? Raising the volume, would that help us? Okay, we'll try that. And maybe if you could speak a little bit closer to the microphone.
Of course.
And maybe just
my aim is not to be disconcerting, so I'll take your advice. What we're saying is that without doubt, the introduction of new immigration arrangements and the end of freedom of movement will have acute challenges for business owners. And to put that into perspective, currently 95% of small employers...
No, I'm sorry, we really are going to have to get this resolved because I'm finding it so hard to hear what's being said here. Could you just maybe speak into your mic just again, Mr.
Yes,
McCulloch?
Of course. Yes,
that's a lot better.
Is that better?
It is. Could you start again for us, Mr.
Great.
McCulloch? Sorry about that.
Third time lucky, it's okay. My feet are still a little wet from the rain, but it's fine. We'll move on. What we're saying is that, to put things into perspective, currently 95% of small employers have no experience of the UK's points-based immigration system. They don't have the capacity or the expertise, and mostly because they've never needed to. They've satisfied their labour and skills needs from local, national and EU labour markets. And at the moment, the percentage of small businesses who have at least one member of staff from the EU is around 25%. That's 5% higher than levels for the rest of the UK. That figure climbs to 41% for employers in the Highlands and climbs again to 45% for firms in the tourism and leisure sector. So these are sectors that in particular will be hard hit. EU workers, they're not just in low-skilled jobs, they operate across a wide variety of occupations, and in fact the greatest concentration could be found in mid-range skills. And occupations such as care, construction and so on. And I think lastly I would point to the research that we published recently, which showed that on the whole employers would react in 2 ways if freedom of movement comes to an end. There are those who would adapt their recruitment practices and they would hire UK citizens or EU citizens and accept the additional costs. But there are this other group who foresee substantial changes to their business, and they would either reduce their operations, wind the business down, or move their operations abroad.
Thank you. All of that sounds very serious, and we'll want to explore some of these issues with you in the course of this morning. But I want to turn to Mr Williams, because you'll have noted that we did a population and demography report in the last session of Parliament, and I noticed something that you stated recently, which says that the demographic issues for Scotland differ from the UK as a whole. You know, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit what the SCDI meant from that and what your conclusions around that statement.
Yeah, sure. I know the committee will have seen some of the projections yourselves, but clearly we have a much greater reliance on immigration from the EU for future population growth than do the UK as a whole, where there's projected to be much more increase due to births and higher fertility rates. So we also have a higher dependency ratio, and that will increase over time. We have a marginally higher average, median age, and clearly we have challenges that relate to the rural nature of large parts of the Scottish economy as well, where there is depopulation that's projected to continue, and in those areas that will have a significant impact on future prospects. It goes without saying we have a tight labour market at present. Historically high levels of employment and low levels of unemployment. So the concern for us is that if we don't address this demographic picture, then it's going to have a long-term detrimental impact on the economy, public services, and the success of Scotland.
And you both sort of conclude that this is going to be a massive impact for the economy of Scotland. I mean, it is a central issue that there isn't enough workers in the Scottish labour market, rather than where they come from. Either of you.
Yeah. Without a doubt, just to carry on from Gareth's points. Sorry, this is a lot funny. You have a situation. I'll try again. Sorry, my appears to be failing. Let's see if that works. So you have a situation at the moment where population growth has been absolutely fundamental to Scotland's economic prosperity. You know, it wasn't that long ago that there were fears that Scotland's population would fall below the 5 million mark, and the reason that didn't happen was because of European working age migrants coming to Scotland and contributing, and there's a definite fear that the size of the labour force will reduce in the event that not as many European migrants come to Scotland and settle to work. I think there's also a fear that it would affect demand in the economy, it would affect the supply of goods and services, and certainly in areas within the Highlands and Islands who already face substantial depopulation challenges at the moment. There are additional problems and issues that businesses in those areas suffer at the moment. I mean, just to put that into context, you know, there are in many Highland schools which are continuing to deteriorate at the moment with the supply of extra labour. Were that to decrease, then you would have substantial skills challenges in the future.
I mean, when we presented our population demography report and we had conversations with the Minister around some of these issues, what we were told in response is that Scotland's skills needs are largely aligned with the rest of the United Kingdom, and we were getting this sense, what problem, and the UK is pretty much the same in terms of its range of issues and difficulties as the rest of the United Kingdom. Is that a view that you share? And if it isn't a view that you share, could you tell us significantly where that might be different? Mr Williams.
Well, I think there are common issues across the UK in relation to particular skills and particular sectors, but as I've outlined and as Barry's outlined, the challenges are that much greater in Scotland, and particularly in parts of Scotland, and those if we do lose access to EU labour on current terms, those are likely to get even more significant in the future. So we have supported some differentiation within the immigration system to recognise that fact, building on what's already there. It's quite hard to comment on exactly what that would look like when we don't know what Brexit will look like, we don't know what future UK immigration system would look like, but as a point of principle, recognising the need, we think that that's the direction of policy.
Mr. McCulloch, I'd like to hear your views on this, just if
Sure.
we are largely aligned.
I think this is a live issue with the Migration Advisory Committee inquiry, and I thought the Scottish Government put forward a very convincing case to show why Scotland's needs are different. I think if you look at the sectoral nature of our economy, its reliance on mobile labour from the European Economic Area, and furthermore, I think if you look at the sectors that are concentrated within Scotland and reliant on this labour, I think there are definitely issues where in the future small businesses would be unable to meet their labour and skills needs, whether that is in rural Perthshire or here in Glasgow city centre. And I think from an relatively outsider's perspective, it's a challenge to analyse and examine who is right in this situation, because you have both the Scottish Government and the UK Government with very different positions. And I think it's definitely fair to say that the extent of differentiation that has to take place is predicated on the belief that Scotland's needs are different. I think we have different demographic pressures. I think we have a different skills base, and I think our economy requires a degree of labour which is both low, medium and high skilled, and that does come from the European Economic Area.
David Duke. Remember your mic, David,
Yeah. On your analysis, Mr. McCulloch, of the various demographic issues you've described, have you done any analysis on what is actually causing the depopulation of Scotland in the first place, and if something was to be turned around, how long that might take?
Unfortunately not. That isn't analysis that we've conducted. Naturally, if population growth can be driven through other sources, then that would have a knock-on economic effect. But whether or not the immigration in the future that will take place, either from EEA or non-EEA people, is relatively unknown. And if you are a business owner in Scotland, you're facing a huge amount of uncertainty at the moment, because you do not know if you will be able to employ European workers via freedom of movement, or whether or not you'll be going through a largely alien points-based immigration system, which can be costly, complicated, and can be quite heavy-handed if you get things wrong.
I think it was you, Mr. McCulloch, that said that, I think it was 50, 20 years ago, there was a real concern that Scotland's population might drop below that 5 million mark, and certainly in my early days as Member of Parliament, that was one of the major things that we were addressing. I mean, this has been, and we know, I think we all appreciate and understand, this has been addressed by immigration primarily from accession nations in the course of the last 15 years. What on earth did businesses do before we had that availability of labour in order to address some of these difficulties and issues, or was it just a story of ongoing decline and difficulty?
I think the nature of small business owners is just to get on with things and to react and adapt to the situation that they find themselves. And it's arguable that post-Brexit they will do the same. But looking back to how small businesses prospered in the early 2000s, they had consistent barriers to growth which are still here. They had access to skills issue, they had access to infrastructure issues, and to the extent that these have been exacerbated over time, and it's I think it's when you speak to business owners, you're struck by how paralysed they feel in the current situation because they don't know what they know, and they're trying to plan for the next 2 to 3 years, and they are unable to do so because there isn't the information available to either look at your capital investment plans, to look at your future staffing needs, to look at how you're going to upskill your workforce, because that has been driven quite consistently by European workers.
Grateful. Hugh Gaffney.
Yeah, cheers. There's concerns about the high levels of employment of non-UK workers, because this puts downward pressure on wages and reduces the opportunities for UK-born workers. Would you agree with that statement?
I think I think there has been a report that has found some limited evidence in certain circumstances that there can be an effect on wages, but there are a number of other reports that that would say the contrary. I don't think we can say that that evidence is particularly strong. I think, on the contrary, there's good evidence that an international workforce can increase opportunities for UK workers. For example, many businesses would have centres of excellence for training within the UK. They might be drawing people in from all around the world, but the fact that it's located in the UK increases the opportunities for UK workers to go to those centres of excellence. And I think oil and gas sector might be an example of that. And there are lots of other potential benefits in terms of having a more diverse workforce and being able to improve contacts with customers, increasing innovation rates and so on, that obviously flow through to higher productivity and the potential for higher wages for all members of staff, including UK workforce. So, I think I think the evidence is actually probably stronger to the contrary, and that UK as a whole benefits, including its workers, from migrant workers.
Yes, just to follow on from that, I'm by no means an economist, but the research that the Scottish Government and the academics who came to the committee last week is fairly clear on this matter, and that the gains from migrant workers far outstrip the costs. And to just take one example, which we don't often talk about, migrant workers, people who are not born within the UK, are substantially more likely to start a business. Whether you look at the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, or you look at some research that we are currently undertaking at the moment, there's the gap's around about 3 times. So you've got people who are born outside of the UK are 3 times more likely to start a business. They provide a lot of that entrepreneurship, which otherwise wouldn't happen. And post-Brexit, there is a concern that pipeline of entrepreneurs, people who come to Scotland to perhaps start work, but struggle to see another way. They have a go at starting their own business. We have one member in Inverness who came to Scotland to work in hospitality, and within a couple of years he was running his own cleaning and property maintenance business. That is a common story within Scotland, where people come with ideas, with drive, and fall into a country that is willing to give them a shot, give them the support through Business Gateway and the enterprise network, and definitely that outweighs the costs that some people identify from migration.
This is quite a key issue, and I know that there's a political debate about this, and we're struggling to find anybody who's prepared to give us evidence that supports some of the claims that migrants drive down wages. I mean, we have the Scottish Government report that you mentioned, And it says the available evidence indicates that any adverse wage effects of migration are likely to be the greatest for resident workers who are themselves migrants. I don't know if you recognise that, and I just want to say something from Eve Hepburn, who I think you were referring to in your response here, Mr McCulloch, who says that there doesn't seem to be a significant impact on wages or employment opportunities if the UK-born population when the economy is strong, but there is some evidence of labour displacement when the economy is in recession. I don't know if you recognise that statement and what your view about that is, and also just some of the things that the Scottish Government have found where there might be an impact on foreign workers who working here who are already in Scotland.
Regrettably, it's not something that we've come across in our research on labour and skills and Brexit-related issues. The one point that I would make is that, for many of our members in the north of Scotland, they in the past have struggled to access skills and staff because there's that flock to the central belt or to London, where a lot of our young people in the islands and rural areas leave, and it has been migrant workers from the European Economic Area in particular, which has provided that supply of labour which otherwise wouldn't have taken place. And there are countless stories in the research that we publish which show that business growth in many parts of Scotland would not have happened without that access to labour and skills.
Okay, we'll come back to you in a minute, Hugh, because I see David Dukett's wants to come in with other supplementary.
I just wanted to touch again on this issue of the requirement for migrant workers to come to places like the Highlands and Islands and other places around Scotland because of this exodus, if you like, in the past to the Central Belt and further away. Do you have any feel for what might happen for future generations, or sort of second generation of migrants that become UK-born citizens? What's stopping them leaving these same communities and going to the Central Belt in London and maybe or back home for that matter?
I think in relation to the evidence seems to be that workforce mobility as a whole is reducing, and it has reduced over the last 20 years or so. As you say, there has been that historic exodus from parts of Scotland. I think there is the potential there through improved digital connectivity, for example, to make it easier to run businesses from these locations, to make it more attractive, particularly for young people to be based in those areas. We know quality of life, quality of education is very important for families, for young people. And certainly a lot of work has been put in the Highlands and Islands to addressing those sort of issues in recent decades, and I think that has had an impact. Obviously, with the creation of the new South of Scotland agency, we're looking at similar moves in the south of Scotland, but there's always going to be a flow of people. Young people are always going to want to spread their wings, and that shouldn't be discouraged. But we need to make sure that we are attracting enough people to come back in, so that we can supply the skills that businesses need and create vibrant communities.
Grateful. Hugh Gaffney.
Just on a follow-up to that then, Migrant Watch, they've argued that instead of relying on low wages and inflows of cheap labour, from abroad, Scotland should do more to mobilise Scottish workers, basically, and give them better paying conditions. Is this possible? Could we do this? Is there an argument there for? I mean, you mentioned earlier there's no actual reports on the evidence found between low pay with migrant workers and UK workers. So is there an actual report we can look at this to then follow up on the second point of could Scottish or UK workers rather be better paid than the low influence we're having, you know.
I didn't mean to say that there were no reports. I think what I meant to say was that there was one report that I was aware of that had suggested that there might be some impact in certain circumstances, but there was other reports that didn't show that, in fact showed that there was a net benefit. So there may be some value in looking at that more closely, but there is evidence out there. I mean, I think it's fair to point out that with increasing in the national minimum wage, national living wage as well, that there is effort going on to increase pay rates for all, and you know, we would certainly say that if we're going to increase productivity, then we have to see that continue, but at a rate that's sustainable for the economy. I don't really see it as an either or in terms of migration and training of the Indigenous workforce. I think we need both, given the demographics, given the skills situation. We very much support the developing the young workforce agenda. We need to help workers with transitions as we have a more disrupted economy. So lifelong learning probably needs more of a priority than it's had in recent times, and you know, older people, we need to think about how we can help them stay in the labour market productively for longer if that's what they want to do. So as I say, it's not an either or from our point of view.
Yes, just to reiterate Gareth's points here, I don't see that distinction. I think that migrant and Indigenous workers create a competitive labour market, and the employers choose the right person for the job, irrespective of where they're from. It's, you know, who has the best skills, the best attitude for that business. And certainly when we looked at this and examined our research, it just didn't come up. It was about attitude, fit and willingness to work, and they would recruit openly, and whoever applied for the job and made it through. They were blind to these distinctions.
I mean, I hear what you're saying there, but there is a lot of places that do employ a certain national from EU, and it's all the same employees. You know, in a lifelong learning, I'm a big interest in that, obviously, because there is a barrier between the language barrier. You get into a lot of places with its low migrant workers, and it's both languages, you know. So I mean, I'm interested in that side of it as well. When you say that, which brings on to my second question about the data. You know, do we have a data across the UK where most migrant workers are? You know, because where I'm saying Lancashire has a big food impact, you know, and there's a lot of foreign workers in certain places, and other places don't seem to have any. So UK-wide, is there a national data on that, on migrant workers?
There is some data. Some of that is from government, some of it's from trade associations. I'm aware Scottish Government is looking at getting better data at present. I think in discussions with the Migration Advisory Committee recently, one area that there's particular need for better data is around self-employment and entrepreneurship. Barry touched on some findings from the FSB, but there could be more on that. And I think we probably need to look a bit more closely within sectors as well. So what particular roles within sectors, what particular roles within supply chains as well, because as we know, that a business itself might not employ a large number of workers from the EU, but if its supply chain does, then it could have real knock-on consequences for a much wider range of businesses than perhaps we're immediately aware of.
I think at the moment we're playing catch up. You know, there's a lot of data gaps, and it isn't until the referendum result that people began to think about this issue seriously. And if you look at our research, which looks at the occupational segregation of EU workers, as I said at the start, it isn't just low-skilled occupations. In fact, there's almost a three-part distinction. You have 48% of small businesses with EU workers who have people in mid-skilled roles. You have 31% who use lower-skilled occupations, and then you have 21% who are employing EU workers in higher skilled roles. And I think, as Gareth just said there, I don't think we fully understand that complexion. I don't think we fully understand why they've congregated and concentrated in certain areas. But from our members' perspective, if you take tourism as one example, it's a sector that employs just about as same people as the NHS. It's a massive employer, and if you go about the country and visit hotels, then you'll see that there's a significant employment footprint from EU nationals. But that isn't through design. If you speak to the employers, it's because of the best person for the job, and that places like Crieff or the Highlands, they've always struggled to access that labour, and they have the mobility of labour from Europe. People who've come over from particularly Eastern Europe through freedom of movement, and they have chosen to start a career in that sector.
Could I if I've got this correctly, you were saying that there's 31% of EU nationals in low-skill work, 48% in mid-skills, and 21% in higher skills. Is that what you said there, yeah?
Yes.
I find these figures quite staggering, because I think the common perception is that all EU nationals are in lower skill work, and this relates to some of the questions that Mr Gaffney said about displacement in the labour market. Why is this belief allowed to emerge that EU nationals who are working in Scotland tend to inhabit lower skills jobs, where, according to what you said there, it quite clearly isn't the case?
Yes, I struggle to reconcile the two realities, for want of a better expression, because certainly there's the reality that we have where we use ONS classifications, and there's the public debate which seems to concentrate on the low-skilled angle and the displacement angle, and I find it very difficult to recognise, because at the moment, certainly within the Scottish Government paper, if you look at the creative sector and the skills gaps that they have at the moment, these are high-value, high-impact jobs which many European workers contribute to. And in our report on access to skills and labour, we had a member from Edinburgh who runs a software development company, and he was reporting challenges he had in attracting staff, because he's competing in the global marketplace. The staff that he's looking for are very mobile, and he was finding it increasingly challenging. He had staff leaving to work in other European capitals because they they have a skill set that is in great demand. And I think that's the other angle here, is that we're not just competing locally, regionally and nationally, we're competing globally, and the decisions that we make will have significant implications for the future of our economy.
But I just think that's a really, really important set of statistics that I think really deserve and require to be, advertised a bit more thoroughly and robustly. Anyway, Mr David Duckett.
As we've already mentioned, the migration for EU workers obviously is currently unrestricted. And so, therefore, the UK only has work visas for non-EU or non-EEA nationals. Can you tell us to what extent Scottish businesses employ non-EU versus non-EU nationals using these visas? So, what proportion?
I'm not sure if Barry does. I don't have statistics for employment of non-EU nationals. I know certainly the existing route is seen as unattractive by many businesses. So where they can meet their needs from within the EU, they would tend to go down that route. If, I'm sure we could help with statistics if you don't have them.
I've got some data here from, it looks like it's from 2016, that non-UK EU nationals made up about 5% of Scotland's workforce. Does that sound about right? And it also says that non-EU nationals made up about 2.5%, with about half. So like a 2-to-1 ratio.
Certainly, I knew the EU figure. I wasn't sure of the non-EU. But it sounds about right.
Because obviously you mentioned the cost and difficulty, and I think it was 95% of SMEs had never had any experience. What do you think it would take to build up the competence in these businesses to be able to handle that point system?
I think that would be a significant challenge, and it really all depends on whether or not the Immigration Acts of 2014 and 2016 serve as a foundation for a new system. So if we operate a system that we have at the moment for non-EE staff, is very restrictive. It's very complicated. It can be quite burdensome, and it's unsurprising that many employers choose not to go through that route because, as Professor Boswell stated last week, it does encompass a significant bureaucratic and cost outlay. And if they can access staff through freedom of movement in Europe, then obviously they will prefer that route. I think we have deep concerns about how a group of employers from the small business side who employs somewhere in the region of 1 million people, how they would work up their capabilities and their scale, because they don't have this experience that larger businesses have. They don't have the HR departments to process work to right checks. And I think all of that, I don't think it's surmountable, but I don't think it's ideal either. And there would be significant government intervention required, particularly on the HR side, to enable small businesses to function in that environment. Okay.
And then next question was going to be around the checks that employers are obliged to make on the entitlement of their employees to work in the UK. Is it clear to the kind of employers you're talking about those requirements, and how onerous are those checks on those employers?
So as I said at the start, we don't have that many employers who are members who take on staff from outside the EE area. But for those that do, there's definitely the impression that they are being penalised for hiring foreign workers. If you look at some of the language around the Immigration Acts, if you look at some of the language on the Home Office's website, I think the thrust of the policy is quite punitive. Rather than how do you get businesses to comply, how do we bring them along? Certainly, I think that's the culture within Scottish regulation. It's a bit more discursive and less punitive. And the introduction of the immigration skills charge is designed to reduce the demand for migrant labour. That is the objective of the policy. It's to make that labour more expensive. And I think the feeling that we get from members is that they are engaging in a free labour market, hiring the best person for the job, and they are being singled out for doing that. And I think the last point that I would make is that there are serious consequences for getting it wrong. Whether that's quite weighty fines per employee if you do get that wrong, upwards of, I think it's civil penalties of up to £20,000 per worker, and that could be due to administrative errors. So if you're not keeping your right to work checks in proper order, I think there are things that employers may not know. They aren't willingly breaking the rules, and to jump forward to post-Brexit if the new immigration system works in that format, I think that will be deeply troubling for Scottish employers.
Right. So what I'm hearing is whatever the new system has to be, the kind of employers you're talking about need to be brought up to speed between now and then.
Absolutely. I think if we're not starting just now to build those capabilities and capacities, then we will have a problem. The difficulty is that we don't know what system will be introduced. We're presuming that it will be based on the 2016 Immigration Act, but we don't know whether it'll be an extension of tier 2 visas, whether there'll be a sponsorship system, and that uncertainty is very damaging for businesses who are trying to make those day in, day out decisions to run a viable enterprise in Scotland.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned significant intervention from government might be needed. What sort of intervention would you envisage, and how costly might that be, and which government? I mean, would this all fall on the UK government's shoulders?
Yeah, I think that to our mind, some of the most effective interventions from government come at a very local level, where they have a relationship with the local business community. And I think one programme that we have in mind it was called Business Gateway Plus, which tried to look at the HR capabilities of businesses to allow them to scale up. So rather than looking at growth in a fairly abstract terms, they drilled down into the business owners' capabilities to do the basics, because they didn't have the administrative skills. Quite often a small business owner is doing 100 million things, and administration and HR is just one. They don't have that specialism, they don't have access to that advice, unless they're a member of the FSB. But I think the broader point is that a government intervention, either from the Scottish Government and the UK Government, would be required for a significant period of time. I couldn't put a figure on that, but I would like to think that focusing particularly on this HR side would be a fruitful way to allow employers to feel more confident, because at the moment employers feel like they're de facto immigration officers, and if that perception is out there, which it is, then it won't take long for that to spread to other employers, and that will affect the decisions that they make. It might lead them to automate and invest in capital more than people, and that would have, again, quite fundamental challenges for the labour market.
So intervention, making sure that all the small and medium-sized businesses have an understanding of the complexities of the immigration system, potentially in under Brexit, is really vital, isn't it? And then, therefore, really potentially it can cause quite significant extra costs for Scottish Government, or Business Gateway Plus would be under the Scottish Government's responsibility, wouldn't it? So
yes, I think there would be. I think there's a very good market failure argument here that would justify government intervention, but naturally this would come at a cost, and if you reflect on Brexit and all its permutations, it seems like a fairly small arcane point, but actually how employers employ and navigate this system is absolutely central to these conversations.
Absolutely. Well, I know myself the complexity of the immigration system, having to deal with it as a constituency MP very frequently. Okay, well listen, can I just ask you about the shortage occupation list and its application to Scotland? Because while it's been pointed out the UK government has permitted some departure from it, it's pretty minimal. In 2010, for example, I think the only additional item for Scotland was restricted to consultant radiologists. Could I ask your thoughts on increasing the role of the Scottish Government in setting the SOL, and perhaps potentially getting a Scottish seat on the MAC, the Migration Advisory Committee as well? That's been mooted by some folk as a possible way of increasing Scotland's influence in these matters.
Would it be okay if I just referred to the previous question as well?
Oh yes, of course. Sorry, Mr. Williams.
I would question, reflecting a lot on what Barry said, whether the current non-EAA system is ever going to be fit for purpose for EU work as well. 205 pages of guidance, the skills immigration charge, the resident labour market test. I think it would need such a major overhaul to be applicable, in addition to then all the work that would be needed to upskill particularly smaller businesses. So on the shortage occupation, I mean, I think it's useful to have within the current system that we do, and any flexibility that's available for Scotland has to be positive. We're certainly aware that there have been more requests from particular sectors of the Scottish economy to be included, or roles to be included within those lists. So perhaps more use could be made of it. I think there's a question mark as to how effective it's ever really going to be, particularly when you have a dynamic economy which is changing all the time, and can that really be reflected through a list, especially in a post-Brexit scenario. But if we were able to have more Scottish influence, I think that would be welcome. Whether we could go down the road of a Scottish seat, or whether it would need to reflect the interests of other parts of the UK, other nations and regions of the UK, I think would be open to debate. But I think having a voice, looking at that geographic aspect would be helpful, as long as it's then backed up by input from employers in particular, trade unions and others that are interested in this area, so that whoever it was that was representing the Scottish economy in that process had as much information as possible.
Okay. Mr. McCulloch, anything?
I think there are a number of problems with the shortage occupation list at the moment. It's really a one-size-fits-all system, where the salary and skill thresholds are set at a UK level, which doesn't necessarily work particularly well for Scotland. And as was noted last week, it's clunky, it's bureaucratic, and it's costly. So obviously that hits demand from the private sector. But I do think, just to pick up your point specifically, that there are opportunities to revise and expand the shortage occupation list, and give the Scottish Government the responsibility for doing that, to look at the labour market gaps, the skill shortages, and I think there seems to be a fault line emerging just now between the Scottish Government and the UK Government on this particular issue. But I think from a small business perspective, we would welcome Scotland's voice being that bit louder within the immigration system, that we looked at concrete and practical ways to devolve aspects of that system, and certainly the occupation list is one way you could do that. I think the other way is by giving the Scottish Government representation on the Migration Advisory Committee. There is a precedent, as we pointed out in our paper. There's a Scotland rep on the Ofcom board. Again, see no reason why that shouldn't happen in this context. But as Gareth pointed out, there are other nations and regions in the UK who would also make that point, that they have to be represented. But I think it's difficult not to read through the research from Dr. Hepburn and see that many other nations run an effective differential immigration system and run it well, and I see no reason why Scotland and the UK is different.
Well, I mean, actually, that was the very next question I was going to ask, because you've got FSB, College of Scotland, Unison, Scottish Chamber of Commerce, many other bodies calling for, at the very least, a more flexible approach to immigration for Scotland. As you've mentioned, our experts from the last evidence session made that clear, that there are many examples of this across the world. I'm just wondering why, because we're still getting quite significant resistance from the UK government to this particular issue. Do you have any sympathy with their approach? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because, as I've said, there's clearly evidence of where this has worked elsewhere in the world, and I'm struggling to understand the resistance to it, to be honest.
I think there is one aspect which we ourselves have some question marks over, and it's whether or not differentiation leads to greater complexities and costs for employers, and that's why we've called for further research on this issue, because to be honest, we don't know. But I suspect if if other nations around the world can do this and they can respond to sub-state local market needs, then again, why can't Scotland and the UK? But I mean, if you look through the research and the literature, it does rely on very strong intergovernmental working. It requires a strong political commitment. In Quebec, devolving aspects of their immigration system took almost 2 decades. It's not. I think there's perhaps a reaction to the belief that devolving immigration is a panacea for Scotland's problems, and I don't think it is. It's certainly part of the solution, but it will take time, and it will take a commitment from both the Scottish and UK government to jointly come together and make the system operable and effective for small employers.
Yeah. Mr. Williams?
Yeah, I think the Home Office has a very clear focus on the net migration target, and that drives so much of what it does. From our point of view, it would be helpful if the debate could be focused around a number of different measures and which highlight more the positive influence of migration on skills. That's a potential role for the proposed Scottish population strategy, for example. But at a UK level, it would be good to see something similar. Clearly, we'd like students to be removed from that target. I think the direction of travel at last seems to be quite positive there. I think there's a lot in Dr. Hepburn's report that we would support from the sort of soft to medium leavers perspective. We do find different views in the membership when it gets towards the harder leavers. Clearly there are businesses and sectors that operate around the UK and want to be able to flexibly deploy the staff around the UK, so they want to understand how that kind of more differentiated system could work for them. And I think more thought is needed there. But for most employers, it really is about is what's proposed going to make it simpler, less time-consuming, less costly to get the skills that we need. So if the system that's proposed has an element of Scottish control, an element of UK control, can we make sure that that's seamless and we get the objective that we really want for our business?
Okay, thank you.
David Duckett.
Just on the point of just on the point of the sub-national divergence of immigration policy or elements of that policy. Could it be the case that I was just doing some rough, not very scientific, but just rough calculations on the size of places like Canada and Australia compared to the fairly compressed nature of our small islands here. Could that be a concern? In fact, I was working out roughly Canada's about 40 times the landmass of the British Isles, and I think Australia's about 30 times. And indeed, Australia have reported problems they've had of people being allowed to work in one state, but then moving between states and having difficulty controlling that. So could that be an option? Could that be a concern for the UK government, do you think?
I think there's definitely a correlation between federalism and size. Just it makes sense. Would it be more challenging in a smaller country? Yes, I think it probably would. I think what we are slightly mindful of is that the direction of travel is that employers in Scotland would be there to legitimately assess whether or not someone can work in Scotland or not. And what that means practically is that if you are engaging in immigration activities as a business owner, then you're not running the other aspect of your business, you're not growing it. So I think there's definite opportunity costs there. And what we are mindful of is, one, that yes, there is greater flexibility, but but you have to retain the mobility of European workers in the UK. You know, there can't be, it can't be an either or, you know, because otherwise it, you know, it becomes somewhat pointless and redundant. So how we do that and how we achieve it is unknown, and that's why we're calling for the Scottish Government and the UK Government to get together and analyse the economic impact of this.
The UK Government are currently designing their new immigration policy, and we're expected to see a bill in the next few months. I mean, we're anticipating this would be a pan-UK bill, and like there's obviously a hope, given what you've said, that there might be devolved aspects to it. What would you ideally like to see in a UK immigration bill that deals with EU nationals?
Yeah, I think it's a bit unfortunate that the bill seems to be coming out before the report from the Migration Advisory Committee, because that really was supposed to be aligning policy with industrial strategy, for example. But from our perspective, we want businesses to be able to access the skills they need in as frictionless a way as possible. We want to make sure that those needs are met across different sectors and different regions, and that diversity of demography and economy is taken into account. And we also want the bill to recognise the need for businesses to continue to move people around within their companies, so inter-company transfers, for example, to locations in Europe, which might take place at short notice, where there might be needs for specialist skills and so on. But we see we want the bill to be used as far as possible to change the narrative as well. I think that's a major point. I think you know, there's lots and lots of evidence that having people in this country leads to further investment. Any time spent in this country leads people to, particularly as they work their way up, companies to be more likely to want to invest in this country. So it's got to try and meet all those needs.
Just before we come to you, Mr. McCulloch, it does seem, at least there's strong hints that it may just replicate the immigration procedures and policies that like go for non-EU nationals. I don't know what you would feel about that, given some of the things you said about Tier 2 and some of the other issues around Tier 5.
I think it would be a significant challenge for employers to react to that system. Just to go back to the original point, you know, less than 5% have any experience in navigating the UK's point-based immigration system. You know, they don't understand it and they've never needed to understand it. And if they are put in a situation where they will have to go through that, it will have, you know, cost implications, business implications, and economic implications. From the bill itself, I think we are hoping to see a practical roadmap that sets out how greater flexibility could be delivered, but not at the cost of the economy, that we retain the mobility of EA staff, irrespective of what is devolved and what isn't. But we're also hoping that they acknowledge the sheer challenge of processing 3 million applications and the stated timescales. You know, how that process is simple and easy and inexpensive, so that the members of staff who are from the European Union can process through that quickly, because the last thing that employers want is their staff agonising about their future, because that would make them less productive, but it would also affect their ability to commit to the long term in that business environment.
Grateful. Danny, oh sorry, Deirdre Brock.
Quick comment, really. I noted that Dr. Hepburn, in relation to a Scotland-only visa, given all of the complexities potentially that could come out of the EU, a possible EU national visa system. She does make the point that she didn't think there'd be additional significant costs because businesses would be having to go through that process anyway. So I'd just make that point because I think it's an interesting one from the doctor.
Thank you for that. Danielle Rowley.
Thank you. We've seen the UK government publish their proposals for safeguarding the rights of EU citizens currently resident in the UK. Could you just give me your thoughts on those proposals specifically, and do you think that these provide the necessary certainty for workers in the UK?
I think the measures outlined by the UK government to simplify the permanent residency process for EU nationals and creating a simple online process is very welcome. I think equally the Home Secretary's comments that there would be a default position of acceptance for those who apply for settled status if they meet the right conditions is also very welcome. But to go back to the point I just made before, I think there are major concerns on the feasibility of registering 3 million EU nationals in the stated timescales and the impact that this will have on the employers with EU staff. And really the last thing that employers want to see is their EU staff leave because of teething problems with a new IT system.
Yeah, I would agree with what Barry's just said. I think our members continue to report concerns among their EU staff. They continue to report that people are looking elsewhere or going elsewhere. So there's issues that need to be resolved to give them more certainty.
Christine Jardine. Your button, Christine.
I don't normally have that problem, though. We've already touched on the immigration arrangements for non-EU nationals and what applying them to current EU national migrants might mean for companies. Mr. Zugut talked about the scale of, if we were to devolve immigration, the difference in scale in Scotland from, say, Canada or Australia. We also know that freedom of movement was essential to, and has been regarded as essential to the success of the European single market. So, is there a danger or is there not a danger that if you start putting in restrictions within the UK single market, the Scottish economy might not be in the same way as Australia has vast federalist areas and Canada has as well. The devolved unit in Scotland might not be big enough to survive within that single market with that delineation, that it might start to undermine the very fabric of the single market and make it difficult for your members to progress on the same level playing field as the rest of the UK if they had, for example, more complicated immigration fulfilments and had to have their own HR departments with different rules, etc.
Without a doubt. I think that's why in our paper to this committee's inquiry and the Scottish Parliament Committee's inquiry into this, we heavily caveat our calls for greater differentiation by asking for further research, because fundamentally we don't know if it would affect the mobility of EU workers. We don't know if that would create additional costs for employers, but at the moment, and it goes back to the point that Deidre Brock made, employers are staring into this void. And things are going to change. Freedom of movement will end, and what we are trying to do is, based on the information that's published, try and gauge the most optimal solution for members to access the right staff at the right time with ease and low cost, because what we have at the moment, it works very well, and we already have within that system stubborn skill shortages in a variety of sectors. So even now, with access to a substantially bigger pool of labour, businesses are struggling to find the right staff with the right skill levels. And I think my concern is that you'll roll forward 4 or 5 years, those concerns are exacerbated by a reduced pool of labour. and that has a knock-on effect to the bottom line of most private sector businesses.
Okay. And do you feel, we're talking again about the difference between EU national migrants and non-EU national migrants. Is there a need to distinguish between the two if we're not in the European Union?
That's a fascinating question, and it's one that I reflected on after last week's session, because fundamentally employers, as I said earlier, they are hiring on the basis of who's right for the job, who's the most suitable, who comes through the recruitment process, who impresses during the interview, and nationality is it just doesn't come into it. So I think if you're putting me on the spot just now, I think I would probably say that employers would be fairly ambivalent about that, because if they can get the same level of staff from other sources, then what would be the problem in many ways. But I think the point that I would make is that these routes of labour have developed over many decades, and I just don't think there's going to be a switch. Even when we have trade deals with other partners, it's going to take time. And quite often in those deals, if you want to have a trade deal with India, then they will want preferential access to your labour market. So I think there's a lot to work out. But again, I don't think it's insurmountable. I think it's something that we could do.
You also mentioned, if I could just ask the supplementary, you also mentioned earlier that it's taken decades to implement a different immigration system in Quebec, and that was done at a time when Canada wasn't pulling out of a single market or going through the economic impact that we are going to be facing in the UK from leaving the EU. Do you think there's a danger that the complication of coming out of the EU married with trying to devolve immigration policy could be potentially damaging for the Scottish economy?
Well, we certainly have said that any devolution would have to take a long period of time. That said, there are areas that we'd like more immediate attention to, reintroduction of post-study work visas, for example. I wouldn't see any reason why that couldn't be done very quickly. We've already had that in place. And it could have not only a beneficial, albeit relatively small, impact on the labour market, but it could help to address the problems that universities are going to have with future recruitment of EU students. As you say, process in Canada, Australia has taken a number of decades to evolve, and it is going to be difficult to get support from Home Office for anything that's particularly radical at this stage. So let's try and focus on the soft to medium levers that Dr. Hepburn has suggested, but keep in mind the potential for those to be expanded upon over time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Daniel Rowley.
Thank you. There are many suggestions on how Scotland's migration needs could be taken into account better when informing UK immigration policy. And some of these include increased representation of Scotland in making policy, specific visas for Scotland, or even areas which could be devolved in immigration policy. Would you endorse any of those suggestions, and do you have any of your own?
Yes, without a doubt. I think as we outlined in our submission, we outline an incremental approach to the devolution of immigration policy, much as it happens elsewhere. I think it's, as Gareth said, I think it makes sense to start at the low and mid-range levers. I think increasing Scotland's voice in the system is a fairly easy win. And as someone said last week, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit from introducing the Scottish Government's representation on MAC, to revising and expanding the shortage occupation list, and then to look more forward to, not just increasing the integration of economic migrants, but how do we make sure that following Brexit we don't have a hit on our business start-up rate. So what role do the international offices that the Scottish Government currently have in promoting and identifying Scotland as a great place to come and start a business? I think they're the three-pronged areas that we outlined in our paper, and we would welcome some movement on.
I would agree with that. I think particularly following on from the enterprise and skills review, there is increased thought being given to how we make best use of Scotland's international presence. Not only governmental but universities and businesses and so on, and there's capacity there to get the message out that Scotland is open for talent. There is potential to make better use of UK embassies as well. And we've seen some evidence from a business perspective that's taking place. So can we build on that and look at potential around immigration as well? I've mentioned post-study work visas. I think getting the message right about Scotland's attractiveness and what it is we've got to offer, linked to that population strategy, could really be helpful, not only on the attraction but on the retention side.
Rachel, can I just have a little look at some of the subnational immigration policies that exist elsewhere in the world? And I think you both mentioned Quebec and Australia as examples of where this works, not without issue, but seems to work quite efficiently and effectively. Every time this has been put to the UK government, they raise concerns about a divergence of immigration policy across the UK. And I noted the words of Damien Green, I think, in front of our committee, where he said it's impossible to have separate rules for Scotland in the immigration sphere because there isn't a border. And then he went on to say, if you're trying to exercise immigration control, you can't have Scottish-specific immigration rules. And I think both of you have referenced some of the remarks by Dr. Hepburn last week, where she says that this is possible and there's a range of mechanisms that could be deployed in order to achieve this. I just wonder where you sit in all this. I mean, is this something that is possible and desirable, or do you recognise what the Secretary of State's concerns are about a divergence in immigration policy that might be detrimental to the whole of the UK? Mr. McCulloch?
Yeah, I think that to answer your point directly, Chair, differentiating the immigration system can be done. It's not impossible. I think if you look at the way in which enforcement currently operates at the moment, really, as someone stated earlier, it does lie a lot with the employers and the landlords. They are on the front line, so to speak, in border control. So hypothetically, that could be that could change and morph in a different environment. Whether or not that is the right thing to do. My own view is that small businesses are best spent growing their businesses rather than being immigration officers, but that appears to be a bit of a moot point. But I mean, without a doubt, divergence would be a challenge at a time of unprecedented change. There is a possibility, as someone stated earlier, that you could see a situation where people come to Scotland to gain entry because it is less onerous and less strict with its requirements. But as was pointed out in evidence last week, that doesn't tend to happen in other states. It's fairly sticky. Once they move to a place and settle and work, they tend to live there and contribute for a long time. But whether or not the porous nature of the internal market would be affected is completely unknown, and again that's why we keep on asking for more research.
My understanding is just with the series of immigration bills that we've had, particularly when it comes to landlords having to check on people that rent, and also some of the requirements of employers now to have work checks. Are we not going to get into a situation where concerns about divergence and seepage into other parts of the UK can start to now be effectively addressed, or have we got this wrong yet, or is more needing to be done? And maybe you can help us with this, Mr. Williams.
I think that's true. I think the introduction of biometric residence permits, those sort of things, offer opportunities. Even the introduction of Scottish rate of income tax is another means. Employers obviously do have concerns about their role, potential for increased bureaucracy. But I think the evidence from elsewhere suggests that a mix of those kind of levers and also some softer ones around statements of commitment to remain and so on can be effective. You're always going to have a little bit of risk of people moving around. But I go back to the point I made at the start around industrial strategy. The risk, on the other hand, here is that we're going to set up a system where nations and regions of the UK can't get access to the skills they need. London probably will. It's a massive attraction for people from right around the world and people from within the UK. So we might have a more unbalanced economy. We need to find a way where we can encourage people to work where they would most benefit different parts of the country.
What I find always difficult to understand and comprehend is in the relation of a subnational immigration policy. As somebody from EU or the rest of the world is offered an opportunity to work in Scotland and they're subject to all this, they're able to work freely and legally, why on earth would they risk all of that opportunity to work there, descend into the black market, go to other parts of the United Kingdom where obviously if they're going to be located and found working illegally, they're going to get kicked out? Why? I just don't understand why there's a concern where on one side you could work freely and legally, you're in a job, on the other side you enter into a no man's zone where if you're caught you'd be in front of a whole load of sanctions. Surely there's no incentive. And I'd like to know if do you know of any examples where people would leave that free and safe environment and get into a whole place of a number of associated risks.
I think experience from abroad suggests that there is a risk. It's limited, whether or not it's related to people not really understanding the requirements that are placed upon them at any particular point of time, other circumstances. And so on, but it seemed to be that movement was much more likely to take place after the requirements on the individual had passed. And from a UK government perspective, maybe they would see that in itself as a risk in the longer term. If we in Scotland are offering good employment prospects, good progression prospects, quality of life, all those sort of things, then we can address some of those concerns.
Okay, well, we've got two supplementary questions, and given that Mr. Thompson's not had a chance to raise any questions, we'll let him go first, then Christine Jarden. Ross.
Thank you very much, Chair, and apologies for being late. I can now testify that it's easier to get to London from Aberdeen than it is Glasgow, so apologies for being late. In terms of the answer to the Chair's question, particularly around about the challenge of how in Scotland we recruit and retain staff in particular, particularly in areas we have real skill shortages in the North East, for example, where I represent. But also we heard when we were up in Inverness just last week about the real demographic challenges there in trying to recruit and retain people. We've spoken about a divergence of immigration system, but what is your view on the divergence of our taxation system? So, for example, if we were to be paying more in tax in Scotland than the rest of the United Kingdom, there's a commission, as you know, that is looking at this issue. Already in the 2016 Scottish budget, the higher threshold was not passed on. What are your thoughts and what would your view be on the impact that would have on recruiting and retention as well from other parts of the UK?
Again, I think that's something that we just don't know. We're entering into what feels like a new, different era with the Scottish Government very likely going to exercise their income tax powers in a meaningful way. For our part, we are currently conducting research with our members to gauge their opinions on what they think. I think from previous research, we have noted that we would prefer it if income tax rates were the same. But I don't think that is a position that will be unchanged, because if you look at small businesses and the rate of income tax that they pay, the vast majority are basic rate payers. And I think it's highly likely that the Scottish Government, if they are to move on this, will increase the burden of taxation for those who earn over 150,000 or perhaps lower. So again, I'm unsure. It's difficult to answer when there's nothing concrete to comment on. But would it affect? I'm not entirely sure, given that there is, to use the Scottish Government, a social contract. There is, whether you buy into it or not, there is a cost and a benefit to the way in which the Scottish Government operate their system. And what we are trying to understand is, if the Scottish Government decide to do this, what would it mean for our members? Would they incorporate to, if they're self-employed, would they incorporate to reduce their tax liabilities? Would they move to another part of the United Kingdom to avoid paying that level of taxation? Again, we don't know, but from the research that I've came across, the mobility of individuals in tax terms is slightly overinflated, and that once people settle in a location and run a business, or they tend to stay. But I think all eyes on the Finance Secretary's announcement on the 14th of December, and in particular what income tax rates he would introduce.
Well, like Barry, we're very much looking at this issue just now. I think it probably wasn't on the radar for a lot of our members until relatively recently. So we don't have firm conclusions from speaking with them. I think from our point of view, the extent of the divergence and whether that divergence gets wider and wider and wider over time are factors that we'd like to understand. So some idea about longer term intentions would be helpful. We have previously picked up some concern about whether it would be more difficult to retain and recruit, particularly from other parts of the UK. But that said, you can look at other countries that have got higher rates of taxation and are very successful. It's always hard to measure, but if you are able to demonstrate that funding is being utilised effectively, efficiently, and it improves the quality of your country, then I think people can be prepared to
we're running out of time, and I know the debate about the Scottish budget is fascinating, and we'll try to keep it confined to the scope of this inquiry. So we've got the last question from Christine Jardine. Your button, Christine, or nobody will hear you.
Sorry, I actually think Mr Thompson covered what I was going to say. I was going to ask you about the complications that we could be facing with all these different things, but I think you've actually covered just about everything we could possibly ask you today.
Well, there's a very helpful question at the end of a session. And can I just say how grateful we are for your continued participation, both of you. I know you've contributed a lot to this committee, the work of this committee, so we're grateful for that. And if there's anything further that you feel you could usefully contribute to this inquiry, please just send it on to the clerks. Thank you once again. Order, order.